Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of The Deep Dive. Usually we go deeper into the sermon topics, but through this series we are going to be looking deeper into the stories of those that make up the Wayfarers family. With different people involved, we're going to go deeper into their stories. This week is Noah's story. Hey Noah.
Hey.
With me is Ashley.
Hello.
And I'm Jacob. So this week we're going to dive into Noah's story. Before we do that, I want to make sure you're aware that this Sunday is our family feast night. We're going to have waffles and bacon. Now, I'm excited. We're having breakfast for dinner, basically, and that you can't top that. So good luck, Noah. But with that, I think all of the business is out of the way, so we're going to jump right into Noah's story. Why don't you catch everybody up, Noah?
So you want to know, do you want to know where I started in college, or do you want to know where I started?
Let's start with college, when you interacted with different faiths and different peoples. How did that impact you? Where were you coming from?
So I was homeschooled all my life, and homeschool is great in some aspects and then not great in other aspects. Probably the thing that I would say homeschool doesn't lend itself to is you really are never exposed to people that believe differently than you are. You generally are in communities of people that all agree and believe in things that you do, especially if you were part of the community I was, where most of them homeschooled because of political opinions and wanted to be outside of schools of political opinions and wanted to teach their kids what they thought was right, not what the school thought was right. And I don't have anything against that. Like, I think that's, I love that America's a country where we can do that. But the negative of that is that you really are never, like I said, exposed to anybody that is different than your opinion. And so when I went in college, it was the first time that I encountered people that smoked marijuana. It was the first time I encountered people that drank before they were 21. It was the first time I encountered people that claimed they were Christians but would use expletives all the time. And it was a really, I would say, just wake-up call for me in many regards to just different people. And I don't know, there's always been a streak in me to never want to villainize people. Like, I've never wanted to just walk into a space like that and see all that for the first time and then say, oh, they're just evil sinners and I hate everything about these people. And at the same time, though, I was pretty I still held on to my faith pretty hard, and I was also very what's the term? Because of the juxtaposition between how they were living and how I thought I was living, I thought that I was all that, and I thought that I was doing it right. I thought that I was a good person, and they were bad people, and I could point to reasons why. It wasn't like that it was this arbitrary thing, and because of that, I became very, I would say, just like snobbish, and intentionally would not engage with any of those types of people because I felt like they were just living a lifestyle that I didn't want to live. And, some people were happy that I was doing that. And many Christians I would talk to were really happy that I was doing that. But I don't think they understood my mental space at that point, which was very much, I wanted to connect to people mostly. And I've always wanted to connect with people. That's been a thing. But I mainly wanted to connect with those people. And so it was hard because part of me was judging them for their lifestyle, but another part of me was really yearning for connection. And so it was that back and forth of like, how much do I give up? Do I not even really wanting to give up anything of what I was doing, and having this very elitist attitude to it all. And what ended up happening was, thankfully, I had a couple of friends my second year that just sort of accepted me as the sort of elitist, kind of judgmental person that I was, and kind of If anyone's seen Avatar, I was pretty much a Zuko for those first 2 years. I was very just in my own head and very grumpy all the time. Like I was always making social media posts about like being a better Christian, and I was just I was a bit much. We'll just put it that way. And thankfully I had some friends that second year at school that really I guess accepted me for all of that, and it's probably the most grace anyone's ever shown me in my life, because I had such a kind of negative view of people at that point, and of myself too. It was just a combination of different factors, but all of that kind of led to a moment in which I had to really just realize that I emotionally was not doing good, and I ended up in counseling around that same time, and a lot of the growth that happened out of that was realizing that I could seek God's help for a lot of those types of things, the seeking and wanting connection, even though I was living in an environment that was very not anti-God, but just very wishy-washy and wasn't as serious about it as I was. So I learned a lot that I could rely on God's help. And that was, I would say, the first growth moment of my college years was beginning to rely more on spirituality and like prayer. And during that period, I probably prayed more than I ever have. I would go up to a rooftop on a parking garage every night, and just sometimes I would shout at God, scream at God, be angry at God. It was a very not a nice phase, with God, but it was very much a needed phase where I call that period of my life the time where I mainly had like these condemnations against God and my anger phase against God. But
so you were kind of like that moment when Zuko's screaming at the sky.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, to full firebending, just dragon rage. And I wrote a lot of poetry back then too. And I would take a lot of my spiritual thoughts, my just general thoughts about life, and I would put it in poetry.
Yeah. And was there anybody specific that kind of helped you realize that that's the path you needed to go on? Or?
What do you mean by path?
So when you realized that, like, where you were at, and kind of when that change started to happen in your life, was there a specific group of people, a mentor, a teacher?
I had more conflicts than I had people tell me what to do, oddly. I had, this is funny for people that are perfectionists, they'll really relate to this story, but my first year as a drummer, there was, my drum teacher was really strict, very strict, and it was really hard to get an A in his class. He was from England, and England's status for A's is very different than America's status for A's. And so he just had this philosophy that an A was if you did exceptional work, which is what it says on every, grade thing. But for us, A is just kind of like the bar, And so I would get C's and B's. And I'll never forget the first thing I turned into him. He gave me a C on. Now, I'm a homeschooler that's got A's my entire life up to this point. And I just had a rage Zuko moment about it. I was like, you can't judge me like this. I like full on just like chewed him out because he didn't give me enough expectations for this type of level of grading or whatever. And so he had to pull me into his office and just sit me down and basically break me down. And the end of that ended with me like sobbing and like, I'm worthless and all this kind of stuff because I was just so obsessed with being perfect, and I had to really learn that was not the case. So I had more moments like that than like of just like where you are right now is really bad than moments of here's where you need to go. No one really told me where to go. I just kind of had to figure that out on my own, honestly.
So is that where I guess I was trying to figure out how to ask the question, but is that where like your condemnation for God came from? Like the fact that you were homeschooled and, you were used to being around a certain type of people, and then you come into this new environment of, people don't think the way that I do. They don't believe the same things that I believe, and they don't.
No, unfortunately, I also grew up Calvinist. So at that point in my life, I believed that God controlled every relationship and every facet of anything. So if I wasn't making friends or I wasn't in a community of people, that's God's fault because He didn't sovereignly arrange the setting to be the way that it should, and yeah, even like relationships and things like that. If a girl turned me down, it wasn't the girl's fault; it was God's fault.
So it's like you weren't bearing any responsibility. It was just like everything is God's fault.
Yeah. No, it was very much like God can, because I believe that God can sovereignly orchestrate every part of my life. Everything that didn't go right in my life was God's fault. And so a huge part of that phase was just wondering why God orchestrates the things the way it does. That's where I will say, up until that point, I had never really wrestled with that because my life was going great. Homeschooled life was great, honestly. I had some rough patches in there, but nothing was ever as bad as it was that first year. And so, most of it was through that belief, which is funny. I don't really ascribe to that anymore. I don't have a high view of God's sovereignty anymore. I believe in free will a lot more. But at that time, that was a big reason.
So that's what kind of caused you to start wrestling more, was the idea. You grew up homeschooled, being taught that God controls every little moment of every life.
Right.
And that if something like your friendships wasn't working out, your relationships wasn't working out, that wasn't your fault or the other person's fault. That was God's fault for ending it.
Right.
And so when you go to college and all these things are happening, kind of all came to a head, and you were just like, I can't continue this way anymore. There must be something else. There's something I'm not understanding, but in a perfectionist mind.
Right. Exactly. And
so I'm sorry. Is that what brought on like the counseling? Like, did you feel like you needed to go to counseling to deal with those issues of being conflicted over?
No, that was, I think I've talked about that in a different deep dive, how that came about. That was because I also had a streak in me in which, because I was seeking connection, I would oftentimes just text people and let them know that I was very lonely and just really depressed. And that ended up freaking someone out so much that they ended up calling suicide prevention on me and all of that. So that was not of my own will, really. That kind of happened. Though I'm really thankful in hindsight that it happened, because that was the first time that oddly enough, landing in counseling was the first time that someone told me to read a nonfiction book. Up until that point, I'd read only fantasy books. And so it was the first. I don't necessarily like this author now, but the book, I still love this book. It's Fathered by God by John Eldredge, and he's kind of a big like masculine writer. But Fathered by God is just a book that I really related to, because it was his journey through having connection with God in a father role, and he would tell stories all the time about like how he didn't have a good relationship with his father, and he would have to like learn how to do like handyman things, and he'd have to like look up YouTube videos, and he didn't know how to fish and all these different things. And he tells stories about how God like really mentored him in a period where he lacked connection with his own father. And it was a very personal thing. And that really just inspired me, is that like you can have those connections with God that you might not have in the moment, which is funny in hindsight though, because in it got better in my second year, and I did start to have connections with friends. Granted, like I said, they had a lot of mercy for me and put up with a lot of things. And it's funny, I feel like a different person to that Noah. Like I was very different as just even how I dressed and how I held myself. And the best thing that happened to me overall was not a Christian thing. It was that I ended up working at a call center at a bank, and then eventually became a teller, where I was exposed to so many different people, and had to learn how to like talk to people, and as opposed to just like having this little silent judgment kind of thing. And every now and then I still slip back into it. It's just part of who I am. But it's the doing that part of the thing where it's your job to like talk to people about money, which is, talking to people about money is really can get really stressful, especially when you tell them you have a negative in your bank account. But I would say that that probably helped me more than anything in learning how to connect with people, and how to work that. Actually, like I learned how to like, because you've really got to like figure out a way to manipulate people at a bank when they have a loan due and they want to do something with their money, and your manager's telling you, no, you need to take that money for that loan because it's overdue. And sometimes you could like put that off on collections, and collections could handle that, but sometimes you just had to be the person that broke the bad news to them, that like, hey, you got a Visa bill, it's 8 days over, so we're taking this money.
Yeah. And so that kind of helped you get better at talking with people and interacting, and maybe not always the most positive conversations. And so that was in your second year that you got that job?
Yeah, it was weird. I started working that job actually in my first year, but I was really part-time then. I didn't really start to get full-time at that job until my second year there.
Yeah. So as your second year, you're getting more people that are more friend groups, more people that are giving you mercy and grace when they're like,
though
you need to calm down.
I didn't know it at the time, which sucks. Is like it's only in hindsight that I knew that they gave me so much grace. But yeah. And so that I'm assuming that friend group like helped push you into a way that you could continue getting better, Oddly, no. Like the friend group I ended up with was not a spiritual friend group. It was more of a hangout friend group. And they were very mature people that didn't do all of the like stupid 17-year-old get drunk on the top of a rooftop kind of stuff. They were more like people that had a head on their shoulders and were like, hey, let's go grab dinner, and or like let's play video games and do an all-night video game session for like 24 hours. Not things that I would call harmless. And so that's really what I craved was I didn't really want this like spiritual community to like come around me and decide my spiritual path in life. I just wanted friends. I just wanted people that I could hang out with on Saturday night, and that's what I started getting in the second year was that. So I think that's more what they were for me, and that's what I have so many memories of that second year because my roommates were really close with me, and we just that's really what it was just my roommates were my friends, and it was fun to be in that place where you're living together and also living together with your best friends, in the school.
It's kind of ironic though that they weren't in a spiritual group and yet they were showing you grace, and I feel like that's a really hard thing for people who are in church to even do, is to show people grace when that's exactly what we're called to do, and the people who are not in church are the ones that are doing it. So
well, I've found that whenever you introduce the term like spiritual group, things get weird with people. Like it just doesn't like ever work in my eyes. Like I like when it's really natural and it's just like, hey, let's hang out, and there's no like expectancy of the person to be like super devout and holy. Things just go very easly. But when you just like, oh, we're going to intentionally build this community that's supposed to be like Christian, I don't know. I just never, because all of them are Christians, to various different degrees, but we just never, that was never really at the forefront of why we hung out. We never hung out because like, oh, we're Christians and we need to do community. We hung out because we wanted to. We wanted to play video games and that kind of thing. So
And so obviously during this time you're wrestling with God. You're trying to figure out, because you're wrestling with the idea of God's sovereignty in this point in your life. How does that continue to change, and how does your understanding during that time? What was the next step after the Zuko screaming at the sky moment in your faith kind of?
So I would probably Avenue, because I was still pretty Zuko-ish, even with the friend group that was developing. I still had the moments of, and one of my friends was probably the best with this, is like if I was in one of those Zuko moods, he'd be like, let's go get Taco Bell. And he was a great friend to me, still is. But I ended up still feeling that, and so I started going to this coffee shop, really just to be around people and feel like I was connecting with people, even if I felt like I wasn't. And I would just kind of hang out in a back corner and do my homework or just chill and get a coffee. And back in those days, this is funny. Back in those days, I was really into sweet coffees and pumpkin spice lattes and stuff. Like I wasn't like a black coffee drinker at all.
Like the most basic of coffee.
Oh no, I was a very basic kid in those days. Like I would go to Starbucks and I would get the pumpkin frappuccino, and I loved. I was like a basic white girl.
That is definitely the opposite, not the Noah we have today.
Yeah, no, I know. Like that's what I'm telling you. I was a totally different person in this first college, but I would go there and I get vanilla lattes, and that's what I would get every time. And that was the first time I ever ordered a drink that had latte art in it, and that was always really cool, and it felt cool. But I met Becca there, Becca was one of the main runners of Avenue, and it's funny. I remember meeting Becca. I don't remember meeting Jaron or Nick there. It's funny. I just remember like conversations Nick and Jaron and I had after I started like being a part of it. But Becca, I remember like our first meeting, and mainly because she was just so personal. I thought she was attractive, like it was just a lot of things that she was just like. And she was a Christian at that time. Like there was just so many things that my first meeting, I was like, this girl is so cool, and she's nerdy, and she's just like amazing, and all of these different things. And so like I kept coming back really for her. And we started developing a relationship, and found out she was dating someone. And I was like, okay, whatever. And then still came back and was just like befriended her. And that was just like, I don't know if still to this day, if anyone has made me feel more like I belonged than Becca did in those first couple months. Like I had never gotten that, like just that level of intentional care and motherliness, I guess I would say. And so I felt like I was part of the community kind of from the get-go. And then after that, I started like, being able to like work shifts for them, and I started volunteering for them, and one thing led to another, and then I was like employed there. And so that was probably the biggest moment in shift for me spiritually. That's a long way to get to what your question was, but it's good to have that as background, because when I got there and started working, I started really being exposed to really liberal arguments. And at that same time, I switched churches from a Baptist church to a Methodist church, which if you don't know much about Methodism, Methodism is probably the most liberal of the denominations, I would say, in Protestantism. And I was exposed to a different type of preaching at the Methodist church, where they would like preach through the Sermon on the Mount. And I remember one of the first services I attended was during the whole Charleston thing. And the pastor legitimately stopped whatever sermon he was going to preach, and he just did a service as Christians mourning what happened in Charleston. And that's all it was. No Bible preaching. It was just like, we're going to mourn that this happened. And I was really attracted to that. Like I was so attracted to Christians that didn't just like read a book and like think about how to live in their own personal moral lives, but like actually like looked at the news and said, hey, we're going to change our service based off of what the news is saying right now. You know, like that was the first time I really realized that my faith could mean more than just like whether or not I end up in hell or heaven. It could mean how it affects my politics, you know, how it affects like what I go into my life believing and what I go into my life doing. And so I had that happen where I'm hearing a lot of sermons about that. And at the same time, I'm getting exposed to a lot of just Christians that have opinions about immigration, have opinions about abortion, have opinions about all of the hot button issues, homosexuality, that are very different than what I grew up in. And they weren't ever... it was the first time I was exposed to like a biblical argument, you know, like for me, it was, I had always thought that those people just believe what they believe and don't have any type of biblical argument at all. And they're just, you know, kind of just trying to get this belief into the forefront. But, you know, like I was exposed to the arguments about, you know, how we think we should focus on these verses and not these verses and just different things. And I heard a lot of arguments that I didn't necessarily agree with, but made me empathize with the camp. I was like, okay, this camp is not as dogmatic at the time, and it changed as time went on. But at the time, they were not as dogmatic or as harsh as I had been raised up hearing, at least the people that I was around. And I know that people have had different stories with that, but for me, they were not as harsh. And so as a result, I really wanted to pursue that, and I was always asking questions and trying to figure out where I sat in that. And that was really healthy for me because it really did force me to like, that was really the point where I began to realize that I didn't intellectually know everything. And that's kind of what I mentioned in the Instagram story is at that point, pretty much everything was up for grabs. Like at that point, I wanted to know what I believed, not what my liberal friends believed and not what my conservative upbringing was telling me. I wanted to figure it out for myself. And that's really when I started reading. Every book I could get my hands on. I read a lot of N.T. Wright. I read a lot of, who's kind of like the big name for learning about how to marry like politics and faith, I would say, and why that's important to marry those two. And then I read a lot of C.S. Lewis at that time. That's when I really made the dive into C.S. Lewis. And just had a whole bunch of voices from the Christian faith to really sort of improve my understanding of culture. And at the same time, I also got into secular philosophy a lot, and I was really in philosophy. So all of that kind of hit, and it has kind of carried me on all the way to this day. Is that I really truly believe that had I not done that intellectual divide, that I probably would have just been a Christian that just sat in a pew and didn't do anything the rest of my life. But my faith became real for me when I did that intellectual pursuit of what about this is right, what about this is wrong from the liberal side, and what about this is right, and what about this is wrong from the conservative side.
So was that like during the time where you were, I guess not just understanding other people's beliefs, but trying to understand why you believe what you believe?
Yeah.
So it wasn't like, I'm not believing this just because my parents told me or my pastor told me. I'm like, I believe this because I looked into it and this is what I believe.
Exactly.
Because I researched it.
Yeah, and I have a really interesting, I hate to BS people. And so like if someone comes up with an argument I haven't heard before, I have actually this kind of insecurity of, I've never heard that before. Like, I don't know how to address that because I've never heard that before. I need to go read something about that so that I can have a cognitive understanding opinion about that, you know, as opposed to, I've noticed most people, if they hear something that they haven't heard before, they're like, oh, okay. And then just kind of go back to their life, you know, like I'm very different in that I just kind of, as soon as I hear something I've never heard before, it makes me want to go learn it. It's a very much part of who I am, and so that was a lot of that time in my life. And I ended up, oddly enough, at the end of that phase, just becoming very disillusioned because Trump happened, and when Trump happened, all of my liberal friends became dogmatic. Like, it was an obvious change from after that to before. They switched from being these people that kind of were okay with a conservative walking in and talking about things to completely vocalizing their not okayness with this, you know. And it was a very obvious shift from before to after. And so as a result, I was in a different, I had to really boil down after that. And I began to realize that, like, I was going to choose friendship over my faith, honestly, because I just really loved the people there. And so I really stopped talking about faith after Trump, honestly, because I didn't feel like people were willing to receive it anymore, you know? And I felt like it was just something that I couldn't talk about, you know, without being judged.
Yeah, and I think that kind of reminds me of what it talks about in the Bible. And I'm not sure. I want to say it either was from Paul or Peter. I don't remember which, but one of you might know. But it talks about the issue of there are some people who consider all days alike and other ones who consider days more sacred. There are certain people who eat meat or believe you can only eat vegetables. So I think it has to do with not just your level of faith, but also your difference of opinion about things and how, like, we can have difference of opinions in the middle of our faith about whatever, but it can't divide us. And I think like it creates an issue when we can like agree to disagree, but we can't let division come between us. And I think it's a really hard thing to let that happen because you take things really, really personally because you almost feel like it's an attack against yourself instead of just a disagreement of ideas. But
and I totally agree with that. But I also would push back a little bit and say that I did respect that camp for being so moralistic in their viewpoints, even if I disagreed with them at times. I respected that they were willing to fight for what they believed in, you know, like, and it's a hard line. It's a really hard line to figure out when to fight and when not to fight. And I always felt like I was too insecure to fight for what I believed in, whereas I always felt like they were way more confident in their liberalness. And I did always I always thought that, like, I've always respected people that are willing to say it how they actually think, as opposed to people that just, like, keep it all in their heads and never say it. Like, I've always respected people that are far more willing to just be blunt and honest and say, I don't like that you believe that. Like, I far more am willing to be attracted to you if you're that way than if you're the type of person that's just like, well, you know.
So did you lack confidence with that because you didn't know enough about it, or just because you were afraid of the pushback from it?
A little bit of both. Like, that's kind of a yes question answer. It's like I think that I think it was a bit of what did I want to make a big deal about, you know? And I've had this, I still believe this even to this day, is I think a lot of the things that we make a big deal about are not the places that we should fight those battles on, you know? I think we make a big deal with non-Christians about issues about sexuality when I don't see that as a thing because of the fact that non-Christians are going to have a completely different understanding of how to live their lives than Christians are. And so I don't necessarily know if that's the right place to battle about things, you know, as much as I would say maybe battling over shame culture. Like, I think that's one that I actually would like Christians to get a little bit more aggressive on and battle. But I think the reason they don't is because they know that they shame people in their own congregations. So they
So when you say shame culture, because I don't know if I've ever heard of shame culture. So how do you define shame culture?
Shame culture is when someone disagrees with you and you put them down and make them feel like a bad person because they disagree with you.
Oh, okay.
And generally it's done through moralistic things. So like you might think it's okay that I'll just use an example that was big. You might think it's okay that we kept all the immigrants at the border and didn't allow a lot of them into America. Someone might think that that's awful. And so shaming that person would be talking to that person and saying, I can't believe you believe this. How could you believe this? There are people that are in these cages and you should just completely like think of yourself as an awful person for wanting this to happen. How could you think of that? Right. And that's shame culture is doing that. And so a lot of, it's funny, like, you know, the issues wherever you come down on those types of issues, I'm far more willing to have conversations about that kind of thing. But I don't think that tearing other people down because you hold such a strong opinion about something is the right way to go about it, you know?
Yeah.
And I do believe in fighting for what you believe in, but I don't think that fighting involves shaming other people. I think that's the big distinction.
And so one thing that I do want to get into today is, so you were at a different college. You went to one college.
Yeah.
And then that's kind of where you started wrestling with the idea that with God's sovereignty and God ordaining every moment of life. And you kind of started your switch in your personality of, I know everything or I don't know everything. Yeah. As you're moving through that, eventually, though, you made the switch of colleges. You changed colleges and you came to Mid-South.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about that
so
choice.
That also was happening around 2016 and everything. And so what was interesting is that I basically ran out of money and Visible cost $20,000 a year. And so I was like, I don't think I'm going to do college, you know, this next year because I don't have any money. I'm working at a coffee shop. So I was like, how am I going to do this? And at the same time, because of all the political unrest, I had gotten tired of churches not addressing politics, and I had gotten tired of my liberal friends talking about politics all day long. And so I basically just kind of checked out of everything and just tried to do full escapism. And that was when Pokemon Go launched. So I was like big into Pokemon Go, and that was nice. And I'd stopped going to church. Like I just completely stopped going to church because I just didn't. It was really hard for me to listen to someone tell me how to live my life from a moralistic perspective at that time, when I knew that this is not the issue I want to hear about right now. I want to hear about like how to have friends with people that are, you know, of different beliefs than I am and things like that. And so, you know, I remember that season of my life, the pastor was preaching through the book of Exodus, and he was talking about Moses and God's sovereignty and more theological things. And I was like, I don't want theology right now. I know that's important, but I want to know, like, how do we handle this fact that people are really mad at Christians right now because of Trump, you know? And so that was really hard for me. And so I quit going to church and ended up oddly running into Nick at some point, who just really kind of kept after me to come to Mid-South Christian College. And I kind of I went and saw the college and thought it was ugly.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, this is the Blunt podcast where I tell you how I really think.
MSCC.
And so I didn't really give the college much thought at all. And I was like, well, they're really cheap. They're the cheapest school in Memphis.
Most affordable.
Yeah, most affordable. I was like, at least I can get a degree, you know? But I'm like, if I don't get it, like if I don't get accepted, like I knew that I hadn't been going to church for a year. And I was like, if I don't get accepted, it's not that big of a deal. I'm not going to cry over that. So I literally pulled out my phone on a work shift at the bank, filled out my entire college application for Mid-South, on my iPhone. That's how much I cared. And sent it in and was like, all right. I got like a response in 2 days that I had been accepted.
Wow.
And I was like, whoa. And what's funny is because I hadn't been going to church, I had to have like three references. And one of those had to be my pastor. And so I guess my pastor didn't know that I hadn't been attending the church because I just sent him an email saying, hey, can you be a reference? And he was like, yeah, sure. So he was like a reference, even though I hadn't been attending that church in like 8 months. And so I ended up getting accepted and everything was fine. And it was one of these weird situations where I was like, I didn't feel like I belonged there. I felt like I should have gotten denied because I wasn't in church. And, you know, so I came in having a lot of shame about that. Like I didn't really want, I wanted to prove myself in the school because I felt like I kind of got in on a grace card, you know, so to speak, because I had cared so little about it and I didn't honestly expect to get in. And so when I was in, I ended up having a really good relationship with one of the professors here, Chase Hairston, who is really much into fantasy. And he is interesting. He is everything that was my life growing up, you know, the conservative, Calvinistic, everything there, but in a good way, in a loving, caring, responsible way, not in a like. Chase is one of the most knowledgeable people about culture. He did know how people were thinking about, you know, how people on the left were thinking about things. And he wasn't one of these people that was just existed in his own little homeschool bubble and didn't have any clue about society. And so it was nice to have someone that did know those things, but then also still hold all of the views that I had grown up with and really challenge me and push me in those things. I will say that he never really converted me back to that, you know, and I'm sure he's still mad about that. But a part of I've always respected that, and a part of that was really helpful for me because it did get me back in church. He kind of pushed me to get back in church and several things, and that was a good part in me, is that I've always had people in my life, specific individuals from both sides of the camp, that have been good people to me, you know? And so they've always made me aware of the beauty in each of those views, you know, because I've seen good people from both sides. Like when I was at the liberal church, that's the only church I've ever been to where a couple decided that they were going to take me out to lunch and spend the day with me, because I was a single man in a church, and they knew that I probably wanted someone to go out to dinner with them. And that was great. Like that's I only had that at a liberal church. And so like there are differences that I disagree with on both sides, but that really developed my faith to know that I could love both sides. And I started loving both sides at that point, and not hating one and loving the other.
So when you, I guess when you started to change, I guess, your viewpoint spiritually, did it have any effect like with your family? Because I know you were homeschooled. Like, did it create any conflict with them?
That's a little weird because I did very much a 18-year-old thing where I didn't really have a lot of contact with my family from 18 onwards because I'd moved out. I'd moved back in with them for a summer, but I didn't really have a lot of connection with them. And it's kind of like a middle class thing where the push once you hit 18 is that you're on your own. It's not a culture in which you typically like. It's a good thing if you're staying with your parents at like 25 or 26 or whatever, whereas other cultures are like that. They're okay with that. So there is sort of this like, for me, and I was a male, and being a male, I felt that I needed to learn how to navigate life without my parents at 18, because I knew that I was going to have to be a leader one day in some shape, form, fashion. As a result of that, I really wanted to figure it all out on my own. And so at the beginning, it was a lot of a push, even me shying away from my parents, just because I wanted to figure everything out on my own,
Yeah.
try and figure out where I was without any influence. I'd had 18 years of their influence, so it was like, let me try and figure this out on my own, and try and understand things from my own perspective. I also knew that many of the people at Avenue were far in a camp that I didn't think that my parents would ever understand, just because of their political opinions about things. And so I knew that it wasn't necessarily safe to talk about those types of political opinions. And since that was such a big foundational part of learning for me and trying to understand and figure out what's right and what's wrong, it just wasn't an option, honestly. So yeah, I would say that mostly is kind of why it really wasn't as much of a thing. But yeah, so the last couple of years, really probably the biggest thing that happened in those last 2 years was I ended up working at another coffee shop, and then also took over running Avenue. And when I ended up taking over Avenue and running a coffee shop, I was just like taxed to my limit. And
because at that time you were still trying to finish up.
Yeah, I was still trying to figure out a degree at Mid-South. I was in my junior year. So I was doing way more than I should. Like I just really taxed myself that year. And so I had to work on Sundays, and so I stopped going to church because I was working on Sundays. And I just really, that was probably the roughest year since the first year of college when I was 18, because I just really was in a place where I didn't have enough energy to even care about morals. I just, people, I think we should give more credit to the fact that self-control is very much related to how you physically are. Like how tired you are physically is going to relate to how well you have self-control. It's just going to. And I don't think people talk about that enough, because I definitely know it now. And so I think that whole year was a year in which, I went to a lot of bars, I drank a lot, and just wasn't necessarily in a good place. And by the end of that year, what was crazy is that I did really well with Avenue that year. Like everything on paper looked like I was killing it. Like Avenue had gone from like $16,000 in debt to like $8,000 in debt. We had taken our negative $4,000 balance to a positive $2,000 balance. Things were going great, by the close of 2019. And I had the best core group at Avenue that year too. Like the people, I was really honest with everybody and was like, this is the situation, and people were willing to hold their checks, not cash them. And it was just that year. And that year, more people did things for me than any other year. Like I had people that our ceiling would cave in, and they'd be like, hey, we're going to take care of that. Don't worry about it. Don't stress yourself out. We had a window broken in by some vandals, and they were like, hey, we're going to take care of that. And
I remember that.
Yeah, I had more love from non-Christians in that year than I had from Christians. But I mean, to be fair, I wasn't in Christian circles other than Mid-South. But they just took care of me and made sure that I had a lot of on the roof top nights those years, and I had people like talk me off of them. And it was one of those things where it was a very hard year, and I don't think that I've ever recovered from that year, honestly. But eventually I realized that, no, I know you're making money now, but like this is killing you, so let's drop that job. So I ended up dropping the other coffee shop I was working at downtown, and started working for Nick. And really at first I was just working for him. We were brainstorming what to do with the church or whatever. But primarily it was mainly a place for me to get out of the situation I was in. And I'd do whatever he told me to do. And I told him that. I was like, look, I don't feel necessarily qualified to do this job, but this is what I am, and this is where I'm at, and if you want me, sure. And so a lot of the first 8 months was just working mainly on figuring out what we wanted to do with this place, figuring out equipment and sound stuff and all that kind of stuff, which was really fun. And then when Avenue closed, Nick just really felt like he wanted me on full time here, and so I ended up here full time. And so having all of that, like, I know that's like a roller coaster of back and forth and things like that, but having all of that has really shown me that spirituality and growth is not necessarily what I think some people's stories are, where it's just like a steady ascent.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's very much been like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and I think that's more true to real life, honestly, in my opinion, has been that kind of undulating kind of way of living. But yeah, I've now felt like, this is going to sound weird, but I felt like a battle-worn veteran that's kind of been in the heat of like culture, secular culture, and really come out of it with a lot of scars, but still believing what I believe. I've never changed what I believed. Never. If anything, I've probably gotten firmer in my beliefs as a result of all that. But I've never wanted to sacrifice being firmer in my beliefs for lack of love, and that's been, I'm thankful that I've gone through everything that I've gone through in my spiritual growth life, because who I started out with at 18 was someone that did not understand himself or other people. Today, I feel like I understand myself and other people, and that's probably the biggest growth that I've ever gotten, is just being able to control my own emotions and being able to relate to people that I want to relate to and not relate to people I don't want to relate to, and making those choices. And yeah, I think that what I felt like now is that I'm like this bridge between secularism and faith, and seeing the faults in both and seeing the beauties in both. And it's kind of like that Avatar reference where you're the bridge between the spirit world and the material world, right? It's really like that. Like, I just finished Korra season 2, and well, it's funny. Like, Korra makes a really crazy decision at the end, where she decides, instead of keeping the spirit world and the material world separate, she's going to leave the portals open and allow both to intermingle with one another,
Spoilers note. Spoilers.
Oh, come on. It's been out for like 8 years. And like, that moment where she does that is kind of my life. It's kind of deciding to leave the portals open to both, and figuring out how that works, and all the mess of that, because it is a mess. It's not clean, it's not neat, it's not pretty. But instead of closing those portals, I decided to leave them open.
And with that being said, go watch Avatar and Korra on Netflix.
This is not a paid advertisement, though we are not going to refuse a paid advertisement. So one of the things I really love about your story, just hearing certain parts, is the idea that you learned how to both love and accept people that don't always agree with you and don't always have the same viewpoint or worldview as you. But because they don't have the same worldview as you, that's not an excuse to hate them.
Yeah.
And that's not an excuse to push them away and to never interact with them. But instead, it's very good for us to have those connections with people that don't see eye to eye with us. And our relationship can be not always arguing about what we disagree with, but we can learn and grow from each other in that way.
Yeah, I agree. Forgive me for being semantic, but I'm okay with arguing.
Yeah.
I'm just not okay with shaming.
That's
the thing.
And because there's an idea of having healthy conversations with people you don't agree with and still being friends.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you can't grow without it. That's how you can grow and get information and talking. Me and my dad do it all the time. We'll argue, but my dad has said, it's like some of the times where he learns the most is when we argue. because but neither of us usually don't walk away hating the other person for more than a day.
Yeah.
But it's never like a relationship ending type conversation, but we learn from it because there's different viewpoints being brought up and talked about and explained that we never would know of unless we had those conversations. It's very important for Christians to have non-Christian environments and relationships, because if you don't know how to talk to a lost person, how can you help that lost person find God?
Yeah.
Yeah. That kind of reminds me, I guess, there was something that I was reading. I don't remember if it was an article or a book, but it kind of stood out to me about the issue of arguing, because I think that when you get into an argument, people get fixated on wanting to be right. And I think it brought up the issue of, like, there's no shame in being wrong, because it's not about being right, but about getting it right. So, like, when you're exchanging information with other people, you don't have to agree, but just understanding that your viewpoint may be wrong, and there's no shame in that, because the process is to understand something that you didn't before and to get things right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I think if more people can handle that idea, we can, it's easier to show love when we're willing to admit I'm not right all the time.
Yeah.
I can be wrong. The other thing that I really want to point out, I know we're getting close to a time we need to start wrapping it up, but one other thing I wanted to point out was the idea that we never talk about the struggles that leaders have in the church. We always just like to pretend that the preacher man knows what he's doing and has his life together, and his walk with God is never questioned. And whereas, like, really, we can talk about our struggles. We can be light for those struggles. And as you are leadership in the church and stuff, this is a good window for people to realize, hey, you struggle too.
Yeah.
You're not someone who's just on a pedestal that's got all the knowledge and all the answers and never struggle.
No. I've tried to make that really clear at Wayfarers.
Yeah. That's one thing.
Do not look to me.
That's one thing that I've appreciated about Wayfarers compared to other churches, is the idea that we can be honest about we're not perfect. We do struggle. We have questions. We don't live a perfect life, and my growth is not just an arrow going up.
Yeah.
But it's a wavy line that goes up and down all the time. But getting steadily higher towards the goal that you're wanting to reach.
Yeah, I think a lot of churches, well, I've seen that happen at churches before, where they kind of put almost like the pastor is almost like a God, like he has the answer, he or she has the answer to everything. And so you're depending on them to tell you how to live your life, but they don't have the answer to every decision that you need to make or what path you're supposed to take. And it's like, that's not what they're there for. They're not there to tell you what to do every single day.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah. Well, thank you, Noah, for letting us get that beautiful insight into your life and the struggles you've had. And thank you for being very open about a lot of it.
Yeah. I mean, make it open. Otherwise, it'll be revealed in secret later. That's what John says.
Yeah. What's done in dark will be revealed in light. It's inevitable. So thank you for watching this week's Deep Dive. Hopefully you found Noah's story encouraging and enlightening to you, that you can be encouraged, that you're not alone, that other people do struggle. Again, I'm going to plug this real quick. This week
Avatar.
is the, not Avatar, but the Family Feast Night is this week. So if you want to talk to Noah a little bit more about something that he said, something that he talked about, you want to get maybe more information about his thoughts on something, or something that you're wrestling with that he did, come talk to him on Sunday night. Come see him, talk to him. If you see him on Sunday, or if you want to send him a text, tell him how much you appreciate his story and his willingness to share with us. Other than that, I will hopefully see you on Sunday night. If not, I'll see you next week on the Deep Dive. See you, everybody.
Later.
Bye-bye.